Tonight on Nation to Nation, Donald Trump will soon return to the White House, so what does this mean for Native Americans?
Message from the Trump people to Native Americans is either about energy and being able to take natural resources and get them back to markets.
Wendy Jocko says if Canada's armed forces want to appeal to young Indigenous people, they need to revamp their recruiting.
If you've ever actually gone to try and find a recruiting centre in any major city, where are they?
Saskatchewan's election is over and the Saskatchewan Party is once again in government. The First Nations MLA says the province needs to address racism.
And we see that in systems, we see that in representation. There's only 3 Indigenous MLAs in this province.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Everyone is talking about the American election this week and Donald Trump's return to the White House. But what does it mean for Native Americans living in the United States? Joining us once again today to talk about this is Mark Trahant, editor-at-large at ICT News, joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome back to Nation Nation, Mark.
Thank you, Fraser. Glad to be here.
Okay, so I guess the first thing is, in spite of what the polls said, Donald Trump didn't just win, he won big. Did this surprise you, the nature of his victory?
I was completely surprised. I'd like to think that I was reading everything and being very quick to analyze the best data we had, and I was still completely surprised. I think part of it is he pulled in demographics that just aren't polled, and he did it in a way that was. Former Senator Claire McCaskill said today that maybe he knows America better than the rest of us.
Right, and that is certainly something that they're covering. They looked. I know that they were tracking when I was watching CNN earlier this morning. That his vote with Latinos in various states went up, with blacks in various states went up, particularly with males. We talked a lot about sort of the Democrats last week and their moves to or attempts to get out the Native American vote. What do you think about the Trump campaign may have appealed to Native American voters, perhaps?
Well, certainly in Oklahoma and some other places, the Republicans do very well generally. And he probably, and it's also in context with both the black and the Latinos, he moved it up a little percentage. He still didn't win those groups. And that's certainly the case with Native Americans. He didn't win anywhere except Oklahoma. I think the message from the Trump people to Native Americans is either about energy and being able to take natural resources and get them back to markets, or protecting their incomes from inflation and other ordinary household expenses.
This week, and much like as there is here, there's First Nations that in Canada that support oil and gas developments, and there's ones that don't. I would say probably the majority probably don't in Canada, from the ones we've covered anyway. What about, that's one issue. Is there anything else that you think maybe the Trump presidency now may appeal to Native American voters, or how they may themselves sort of try to engage with the new president?
Well, the engagement part's really interesting because this puts Oklahoma in front seat. And the one to watch is Senator Mark Wayne Mullen, who's a member of the Cherokee Nation and the only Native American in the U.S. Senate. He's very close to President Trump and will be a key voice in his administration, whether or not he becomes his representative in the Senate or if he becomes in the actual administration and running an agency. Either way, he's going to have an input. One of the things that he's been an advocate for is better Indian Health Service and trying to improve the funding mechanism for IHS. So I think that might be an issue that could get some consensus across tribal nations.
Now, we also talked last week about the Senate race in Montana. Of course, the results did not go the Democrats' way, or the incumbent. Did you want to talk a little bit about that particular race?
Sure. That was another uphill Montana. I mean, one of the things you're seeing in Western states is as people flee California, they move to states like Montana, but they go there knowing that they're conservative, and so they end up making it more conservative. And that's kind of what happened in Montana, is that new population has changed the landscape for the former senator. And the native vote tried to get out. It did. In presidential years, it's pretty effective, but it wasn't enough to make up that number.
Now, of course, one of the things is access to voting in elections. It tends to be minority groups sometimes suffer about this, don't get the same access as other Americans. I know it's early, but have you heard any reports back of Native Americans having trouble accessing the polls on Election Day?
Yeah, there was a huge problem here in Arizona on the Navajo Nation. Apache County, which is the major county for Navajos, uh, had ballot issues. They had bomb scares, and in each case, they eventually had long lines. They opened the polls for an extra 2 hours under court order, and so it did allow more accommodation, but it was not a smooth operation by any means.
Do you think those, we've heard different things like that and in the lead up, do you think those are something that, that in Arizona that the state will actually address?
Well, maybe the Secretary of Interior or Secretary of State for Arizona has been very open to that. The problem with elections is they're all managed by counties. And each county has its own way of doing things. For example, Navajo County, which is also on the Navajo Nation, was just the opposite. In Apache County, you have to vote in your exact precinct. And so if you get your map a little bit wrong, if you live way out in the sticks and you come with your vote, you might not be able to cast it. In Navajo County next door, it doesn't matter what precinct you're in. You can take your vote to any precinct and the county will count it. So those little kinds of things make it very difficult. I mean, one we're hearing in Alaska that has just made it really difficult is they've gotten rid of a lot of post offices and instead now have self-service post office, which means they don't stamp the ballots in time. They might not get stamped for 2 or 3 days after Election Day and therefore become invalid.
Now, of course, there's always been racial tensions in the United States, and in recent years, it's obviously been a real issue. This, in a lot of ways, I guess, was a racial election, cut across lines, particularly in terms of immigration. Now that Donald Trump is once back in the White House, do you see those racial tensions are set to increase?
Absolutely, unfortunately. I mean, just looking at it objectively, you had a candidate who is not only a racist, but a misogynist and quite clear about that. And so that gives permission to everybody else to do that. And that's going to be tough for a lot of people. And one of the areas of immigration I think so fascinating is you look at Mexican immigration, and many of those people are indigenous and they don't speak Spanish. They don't have any government protocols for how to deal with indigenous languages. And so some of the challenges faced are because of their indigeneity.
And maybe as a last question, it didn't really get talked about maybe so much during the campaign, but I have seen observers commenting this morning that, Americans as a whole simply were not ready to elect sort of a woman, and certainly not a black woman, to the White House. Is there any truth to this?
Well, I think the evidence is there. Yeah. Although I will say this, that she got her votes. The problem wasn't that she didn't get what her campaign was run, I think, flawlessly. The problem is that he brought in new voters, and those voters probably did not want to ever see a woman get in, or particularly a woman of color.
Mm-hmm. Certainly it was a complex path that they had sort of charted to the White House, and I guess in the end it didn't work out, or didn't get close. But as always, thanks again.
And that's actually one key point, is that this is going on around the world where incumbent governments are getting thrown out. And this was an incumbent government, even though it was a vice president.
Yeah, very much true. We've seen that sort of time for change kind of here in Canada in recent provincial elections, or incumbent governments getting challenged pretty close to what they weren't thinking. And of course, we have a government here in Canada that, if you read the polls, they're going to have a tough road ahead to get reelected. But I guess for time purposes, we'll have to leave it there. But thanks again, as always, Mark, for joining us and giving your thoughtful insights.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll talk to Canadian Armed Forces veteran Wendy Jocko about Indigenous Veterans Day. Welcome back. On Friday, Indigenous men and women who have served in Canada's armed forces will once again be honored as part of Indigenous Veterans Day. Wendy Jocko is a former chief of the Algonquins of Bikwaknagan in Ontario. She's also a member, or former member, of the forces herself and an advocate for Indigenous veterans. She joins me today from her home in Bikwaknagan. Welcome to Nation to Nation, Ms. Jocko.
Well, hello there, Fraser. Pleased to see you again.
Excellent. Yeah. So I guess I thought I would start if you could maybe briefly tell our viewers about your own experience and servicing Canada's armed forces.
Well, I guess I would like to start with my family experience, if you don't mind, Fraser. You'll notice behind me an odd-looking dotem there, but that's actually my great-grandfather, Pierre-Louis Constant Pennessy's signature mark, or his dotem. He actually fought in the War of 1812 with four of his sons. And my great uncles, and there was four of them, one was actually killed in action during World War I. So Uncle Peter LaValle, he was actually killed at Vimy. My father and five of his brothers joined the World War II war effort. And so there was my father, five of his, and my own mother. She was also in the military. I joined in 1979 and I retired in 2002. So I did approximately 23 years in the service, and I did have two tours of duty in Bosnia. And following in my footsteps was my late son, James. He joined the 1st Royal Canadian Regiment. And unfortunately, he passed away last year, and he was actually buried on Indigenous Veterans Day. So it's quite a significant day for me.
Okay, of course, yeah, we talked to that briefly in the lead up. Very sorry to hear that, and our condolences go out to you and your family, because I know it must not be an easy time for you in that way. Going back to sort of your family's service, that's not that uncommon to have, Indigenous families, other ones, that have been really part of Canada's forces in the world wars and Korean action, Afghanistan, you name it. Indigenous people have been part of Canada's armed forces, are a big part of it. Of course, they always haven't received the same benefits as non-Indigenous veterans, and of course this is due to colonial system and racism. Do you think things are changing, though, slowly or now for the better in that way?
Well, I believe they are, Fraser, because the Assembly of First Nation Veterans Council, there's one representative for each province and territory, as we know. They are staunch advocates for Indigenous rights and veterans' rights in particular, and they have worked tirelessly to improve the lives of Indigenous veterans across Canada, as well as the Aboriginal veterans work on behalf of Indigenous veterans, to fight for their rights and their benefits and improve, daily life. And in comparison to days gone by, of course, as you mentioned, the colonial system, our Indigenous veterans, when they did return home from the war, well, a lot of them were enfranchised. They weren't actually even permitted to return back to their home communities. And, it not just affected them, but it affected their families as well. So, yeah, it's the harsh reality of the colonial system of the past and how Indigenous veterans were treated. But, for myself, I must say that, Veterans Affairs has been very good to me and in supporting me as a veteran. So I hope, other veterans could and can say the same.
Right, and it's sort of been a sensitive topic in a way that Canada has, like, in all these interviews, of course, the biggest thing that is Indigenous veterans from the Korea or the World Wars or World War II mainly didn't benefit in some of the land that was given, and also those veterans got free, sort of subsidized education, free education that allowed them to carry on with careers, and of course the Indigenous veterans didn't get that. Is there, in some of you are in contact obviously with Veterans Affairs, things like that. I've noticed in the past there's been some hesitation to talking about that publicly. Have you noticed any movement on the government there, that the sort of an admission that that our Indigenous veterans of that certain age really didn't get any benefits, although they fought for Canada?
Well, I can't say that it's been a focal point of any significance that I can recall, but yeah, it was certainly, a certain black mark on our history regarding our Indigenous veterans, that's for sure. And, don't forget, during both wars, first and second, we actually weren't even allowed to vote till 1960, as I understand. So we weren't even considered, Canadian citizens and good enough to vote.
Now, the other thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is that, of course, this has been well documented as Canada's forces have had a problem with sexism, and it has not been an easy place for women often to work. Did you ever experience anything like that yourself, or did you see any movement there that the forces are changing a little bit?
I must be honest, so yes, I did. It was certainly a harsh environment. Just to let you know, my first posting was to an Air Force base, and it was a relatively, trouble-free 6 years that I had there. But unfortunately, after that, I was posted to an Army base, and that's where, there was certain, discriminatory practices and, certainly against women that I noticed. And, there was a chauvinistic, sexist type of attitude. And, well, you may or may not know, but recently there has been, a sex class action suit launched against the military. And, a lot of women actually were involved in that, including myself. So, yeah. But I know that there has been a focus, to really rid the military and other organizations of that type of behavior, and for the protection, not just of women, but all genders.
We'll have to end it there for time purposes, but once again, thanks very much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Fraser. Nice to see you again.
Up next, we'll talk to Saskatoon NDP MLA Betty Nippy-Albright about the recent Saskatchewan election and what it means for Indigenous people. Welcome back. Saskatchewan recently re-elected a Saskatchewan Party government to a 5th consecutive term, but the election was much closer than recent races, with the NDP picking up 27 of the province's 61 seats. Betty Nippy-Albright is a member of the Kiniston Saulteaux Nation. She was also re-elected to a 2nd term as an NDP MLA. She joins us today from Regina to talk about what the election results mean for Indigenous people in the province. Welcome back to Nation to Nation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
All right, so I thought I'd start ask you first off that although the NDP, of course, didn't win, you must be pretty happy with how the party fared in the election compared to recent elections.
Oh, absolutely. What I'm really pleased at is that we won back Athabasca. And so we won 2 large rural seats, which is fantastic. And they're both Indigenous. So representation really matters.
Right, and I know that seat had gone Sask Party, I think, in a by-election, but that was kind of an anomaly because it pretty much always has been a NDP seat, from what I understand.
Absolutely, and part of the reason what happened is when you have a representative in representing your constituency and you're not listening to them, you run the risk of being ousted, and that's what happened with the Athabasca. He was Indigenous, and the community obviously didn't feel that they were heard, and they had a voice at the legislature. And I'm just so delighted that NDP was able to win that back.
Right, I guess the voters are always right in the end, so that's kind of what happened. But I thought I would also ask you, I kind of followed the election from afar, and wasn't that much different than some of the other ones that have been going on in other provinces, even some of the issues federally here that, sort of bread and butter or cost of living issues really dominated. Did that take away, though, did sort of Indigenous issues, maybe specific, get lost in the campaign?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Indigenous issues get lost by all political groups. That's what Indigenous people would say. However, under Carla Back, we did make commitments to the Indigenous community that if we were elected, that here's the things that we were going to do. And obviously we're not forming government. We are still very much committed to taking the Sask Party to task on the Indigenous issues. And any time that it's important that those that are elected in positions also include Indigenous issues and talk about them, and not only once or twice a year, but that they're ingrained in all that we do when it comes to issues that we raise in the legislature.
Right, so I thought I would ask you about that next. You'll soon be back, I guess, at the end of this month in the legislature. There's probably a whole host of issues, but what are some of the specific, maybe Indigenous issues that you will be pushing the government on?
What we've heard from Indigenous people is they would like representation, and they would like to hear Indigenous issues talked about in not only Indigenous media, but also in particular in mainstream media, that it needs to be out there, that Indigenous issues need to be talked about. And we're not limited to just duty to consult, residential school. There's health, there's education, and the underlying theme in all of that when it comes to Indigenous issues is that duty to consult, because duty to consult is the foundation of where all these other issues lie when it comes to Indigenous issues. And also, it's important that we talk about the protection of the inherent and treaty rights for the people, because we need to remain relevant about to the Indigenous community. If we don't talk about those issues that are important to them, they won't come out and vote.
Okay, I thought I would move also to, this won't surprise you, but coming from the province and when I was living there covering issues, there has been a lot of racial tensions historically and there even in recent years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It's, things like the Gerald Stanley trial come to mind, these sort of, this real divide that the province has unfortunately had. Where do you see those relations between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people right now as we speak here in 2024?
Well, we absolutely have a long ways to go. When I was elected in 2020, I talked about how racism is still very much a part of Saskatchewan. And we see that in systems, we see that in representation. There's only 3 Indigenous MLAs in this province. And that's a shame. We should actually have a whole slew of them, but we don't. And that talks about how racism is still very much ingrained in all political spheres, including provincial.
So obviously lots of issues there, and I guess you'll probably be glad to get back into the legislature to sort of question where the government is going on them. But unfortunately, we'll have to end it there. But thanks very much, as always, for joining us here on Nation to Nation. We appreciate your insights on what's going on in Saskatchewan.
Thank you for asking me to join you and chat with you. Thank you. Have a good day.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.